Hello again, hockey fans, and welcome to a brand new player bio series. This will be a three-part video series on a man who wasn't known for being fancy, as you wouldn't typically see his goals on highlight reels at the end of a night on Sports Desk on TSN. But he's a guy that many coaches feel is beneficial to their given club. His name was Dave Andreychuk. What he could do well was put the puck in the net and be a driving force on the power play. He also had a great work ethic, was a team player, tremendous leader to any given team he played for. But of course, we're going to look at part one of his career, the part that many remember the most, his initial time with the Buffalo Sabres. David John Andreychuk was born on September 29, 1963 in Hamilton, Ontario. The city of Hamilton, despite not having a pro sports team other than football's Hamilton Tiger Cats, is a working-class city where many people love their sports, and Andreychuk grew up participating in many successful hockey programs across Ontario. In the 1979-80 season, he played for Hamilton at the age of 16 for the Ontario Minor Hockey Association, had 25 goals and 24 assists for 49 points in just 21 games. He then graduated to the OHLs in the Oshawa Generals. He did really well there, including a season where he had 57 goals, 43 assists for 100 points in just 67 games. Come the 1982 NHL draft, Andreychuk had drawn a lot of attention, mainly due to his size and his ability to power the net on the power play as well. The draft's biggest hype that year was around junior star Brian Bellows and where he would go. The Buffalo Sabres made a big change, however, way back in 1979 when they hired Scotty Bowman as coach/general manager to the club, hopefully to help them find some championship glory. Bowman, of course, was coming off 8 immensely successful seasons with the Montreal Canadiens, 5 Stanley Cups in all, and just coming off 4 in a row. The Sabres had the second best record in the league in the 1979-80 season, but when Bowman stepped away from the bench to focus on management duties, the Sabres were still very good, but not as great as the first season Bowman took over. He clashed with such coaches as Roger Neilson and Jim Roberts, so he decided he was going back behind the bench for the 82-83 season. And due to Bowman's smart savvy, they had 3 first-round draft picks. For their first pick of the draft, the rumor goes that Bowman wanted Scott Stevens. However, the Caps took him just before then. So wanting a defenseman, Bowman took another future Hall of Famer in Phil Housley. 3 picks later, Bowman took Paul Cyr, a gritty forward from the Victoria Cougars in the Western Hockey League. They had to wait 7 more picks for the next one, and they take Dave Andreychuk. Again, his size at 6'4" and weighing over 200 pounds got him noticed, despite not being any type of finesse player in a time where there were many in the league. Well, he's a first-rounder, taken 16th overall. Andreychuk made the team in 1982 along with fellow rookies Phil Housley and Paul Cyr. The team still had one of the best players in the game, the legendary Gilbert Perreault, leading the way as captain. The team had talented forwards such as Mike Foligno, Dale McCourt, Tony McKegney, and two-way forward Craig Ramsay. A defense led by Mike Ramsey and Lindy Ruff, and in goal, Bob Sauve and a young Jacques Loutier. Andreychuk made his debut on October 6, 1982, hosting their division rivals, the Quebec Nordiques. The Nords were leading 2-1 in the second period when Andreychuk was set up by Craig Ramsay, and it may not have been a pretty goal, but it was his first career goal in his first career pro game, and it tied the game 2-2. However, the Sabres would end up losing 6-4. The second game of the season was in Quebec as part 2 of a home-and-home series, and on that night it was the same story. The Sabres were down 2-1 in the second period, and Andreychuk tied it again, but the Sabres would find themselves down 5-2 in the third period. Andreychuk scored in a nice individual effort to start a comeback, but they lose again 6-4. But his career was off to a good start with 3 goals in his first 2 games. Indeed, Andreychuk's rookie campaign was off to a great start, and then on October 24th, in a game against the St. Louis Blues, he had his first 3-point night with 2 goals and an assist. And he had 9 points in his first 10 games, making waves in Buffalo and garnering some fans. However, Andreychuk dealt with some injury issues and found himself to be quite inconsistent on the score sheet. He was later sent back to his junior hockey team in Oshawa, which allowed him to compete for Team Canada in the World Junior Ice Hockey Championships, where Canada took home the bronze, and Andreychuk was the team's leading scorer, and was 5th overall in the tournament. 3 days after the tournament, however, Andreychuk returned to Buffalo and would be scratched for some games, even a healthy scratch, as despite his good play, some critics were quick to label him, quote, lumbering and very slow. However, on January 23rd, he notched 3 assists for a 3-point night and a win over the Winnipeg Jets. He'd remain a part of that lineup for the rest of the season, and on March 23rd, 1983, he would score a goal and 3 assists for a huge 4-point night against their division rivals, the Hartford Whalers. The Sabres made the playoffs, finishing 3rd place in the Adams division, and Andreychuk didn't see any action in their shocking first-round sweep of the Montreal Canadiens as the team held Montreal to just 2 goals for the entire series. The Sabres, however, had to prepare to take on the big bad Bruins, who had the best record in the NHL that year with 110 points, a team consisting of a very stacked lineup such as Rick Middleton, Barry Peterson, Keith Crowder, Peter McNabb, a young Mike Krushelnyski as well up front. On defense, you had Mike Milbury, future Hall of Famer Brad Park, Mike O'Connell, and of course the one and only Ray Bourque. And in net, you had Vezina Trophy winner Pete Peters. The team split the first two games in Boston, and Andreychuk finally made his playoff debut in Game 3. Early in the third period, it was tied 2-2, and Mike Foligno set up Andreychuk. His first playoff game, his first playoff goal to give the Sabres lead 3-2, and what would end up being a 4-3 win as the Sabres took a shocking 2-1 series lead. The Sabres were humiliated in Game 4, however, by a score of 6-2, and Dave was -2 in the game. It was even worse in Game 5 when the Bruins throttled them 9-0, and Dave was, well, a non-factor much like most of the team, granted. He didn't see much ice time in the Sabres' 5-3 win in Game 6 to tie the series to force a Game 7. And he also didn't suit up for Game 7, which the Sabres would lose in overtime from a goal from Brad Park to be eliminated. Not exactly a spectacle of a debut for Dave, a goal in his first playoff game, but the rest of the way wasn't much of a factor and was a -2. Dave had a good rookie season with 14 goals and 23 assists for 37 points in 43 games, and gelled nicely on the ice with fellow rookie Phil Housley, who would be a runner-up for the Calder Trophy, as Housley assisted on 4 of Andreychuk's 14 goals, while Dave would assist on 6 of Housley's 19 goals, nearly a third. He also clicked with Andre Savard throughout the season, as well as short-lived Sabre Malcolm Davis. Andreychuk's 37 points didn't even put him in the top 10 in rookies, as it was another year stacked with rookie talents like many of the years in the 1980s. He still had an impressive showing, however, and was a +4 to boot. He went back to his junior club and won the bronze medal for Team Canada in the 1983 World Juniors and led the team in scoring. And while his year was impressive, his future with the team wasn't exactly what you'd call solidified. Andreychuk actually looked really good in training camp going into the 1983-84 season, was made a full-time member of the Sabres roster, which now included an 18-year-old goaltending rookie named Tom Barrasso. Many thought Bowman was nuts for making that pick. In the third game of the season, a win over the Washington Capitals, Dave had 2 goals. However, soon after, he'd go into an 8-game scoring slump that brought out many critics, even some saying he should be sent to the minors, and his ice time was being cut. However, he picked his game back up again, had a huge 2-goal night against the Montreal Canadiens in a win on the road on November 29th, and in the following game, a win over the St. Louis Blues, he had another 2 points. And Dave was down a top line with Mike Foligno and the great Gilbert Perreault. At 33 years old, he was having an excellent season in his own right. The Sabres were rolling, and Dave had a 2-goal, 2-assist night for a 4-point game in a win over the Philadelphia Flyers, and the Sabres were challenging the Bruins for first place during the entire season. Andreychuk was providing a strong on-ice presence to boot, as his force on front made the top line all the more destructive, and his defensive play was solid as well, something Bowman always stressed. The Sabres were turning many heads in the NHL, as they were surprisingly really good and up the upper tier with their superb play, and Dave was becoming popular in the eyes of many loyal Sabres fans. Being from Hamilton, Ontario, which is just an hour away from the border, he was seen as somewhat of a working-class hero for the team. Not fancy, but at least he got the job done and was a hard worker. There was a huge game on January 23rd as the Sabres battled the Boston Bruins. The Sabres trailed the Bruins going into that game by a point and had won 9 in a row at this point, and Dave had 9 points in those 9 games. This was also a road game, which had a lot of eyes on it as this rivalry had taken a whole new turn after last season's epic playoff clash. Both teams exchanged goals in the first period, and in the second period, Craig McTavish gave the Bruins a 2-1 lead. But with 22 seconds left in the period, Perreault to Foligno to Dave, he scores, and the game is tied 2-2 after 2. Peterson and Bourque exchanged goals in the third period, but with 2:09 to play, Dave scores again to give the Sabres a huge 4-3 lead. And then 10 seconds later sets up Paul Sears' goal, and the Sabres obtain a huge 5-3 win to take over first place on the road against their heated rivals. And Dave has a 3-point night, and he's named the first star of a very important game, and is truly finding his identity as one of Buffalo's top forwards. Dave continued to roll As from February 18th to February 23rd, he went on an 8-game point streak that saw him score a huge 19 points, including 3 3-point games. And the Sabres won 7 in a row during that stretch as well. He went into a minor slump in March, but he broke out of it and finished the season strong. And the Sabres finished with their first 100-point season since 1979-80 with 103 points, but finished just 1 point out of first place to the Boston Bruins in the end as they went back and forth the rest of the season. Dave's sophomore season was huge as Buffalo fans were starting to order his jersey, which again was rare back then. They didn't sell him a lot in stores like they do now, but either way, he was becoming quite a folk hero. For the opening round of the playoffs, the Sabres would have to get ready to face the Quebec Nordiques, who had a great year as well, finishing with 94 points. But be that as it may, the Sabres were still the favorites to win the series. However, the Nords had a fantastic bunch of talents, one of the best in the game in Peter Stastny, along with his brothers Anton and Marion. You also had left winger Michel Goulet, pesky power forward Dale Hunter, and another in Wilf Paymont, as well as former Sabre Tony McKegney. On defense, they had a talented bunch led by Mario Marois, joined by Pat Price and Norm Rochefort. And in net, the man Dave scored his first career goal against, veteran Dan Bouchard. But the Sabres had a huge problem. Perreault was injured. Having missed the last few games of the season, was not cleared for the playoffs. However, for Game 1, the crowd in Buffalo was amped up. And in the first period, Andreychuk and Foligno set up Lindy Ruff, and the Sabres led 1-0 after 1. In the second period, Rochefort tied the game for Quebec, but just over a minute later, John Tucker gave the Sabres a lead back. But later, Bo Berglund scored, and then 46 seconds later, Marion Stastny did, and just like that, the Nords led 3-2 after 2. Bouchard and the Nordiques held the Sabres at bay, and no goals were scored in the third period. Buffalo drops Game 1. And it gets worse. The Sabres are completely decimated in Game 2 by a score of 6-2, and Dave is a -2. And gets hurt in the process and will miss Game 3, and the Sabres are swept in Game 3 by a score of 4-1. A shocking turn of events and not a good outing for anyone, including Dave. A huge season pretty much gone to waste, and Dave, along with many others, is harshly criticized by that pesky Buffalo sports media. Dave's amazing sophomore season, however, saw him score 38 goals and 42 assists for 80 points, and he clicked very well on the top line with Foligno and Perreault, with the 14-year veteran Perreault assisting on 10 of Dave's 38 goals, more than a quarter, and Dave assisted on nearly a third of Foligno's goals, while he and Perreault collaborated on 7 assists. He also worked well with fellow 1982 first-rounder Paul Sears and with both Phil Housley and Lindy Ruff on defense. Despite the disappointing end to a great season, Dave had truly arrived in the NHL. His 80 points were only second to Perreault in team scoring, and he led the team in goals, and he amassed a very impressive +20, and was key on helping the Sabres back to becoming a 100-point club. After his huge sophomore season, Andreychuk and the Sabres were hoping to shake off the playoff disappointment from the year prior, going into 1984-85. Dave's season got off to a great start. He had 4 points in his first 2 games, then had 3 assists in a win over Minnesota, and followed that up a couple games later with a 4-point night against Calgary. In his first 10 games of the year, he had 15 points. It was among the league leaders in scoring. He was still playing well as the month of November came about. However, he would get hurt in a tie over the Montreal Canadiens, and the Sabres are struggling at 9-10-4. He would only miss 5 games, and the Sabres would go 1-1-3 in his absence. He returned with a goal and an assist in a tie against Detroit. He continued to play well in the new year with a 3-point night on January 8th against the Whalers. He'd only missed 1 game since his return, and in February he hit a slump despite the Sabres improving. However, his power play was missed. The Sabres had one of the best units in the league that year, but Dave helped them improve drastically as time went on. In March, he was finding his groove again, with 2 goals in a win over the Capitals and a 3-assist night in a win over Hartford. He missed a couple more games, but he had a little bit of trouble when he returned. On March 20th against the Canucks, he'd get hurt again. It would miss the rest of the regular season, but the good news was he'd be ready in time for the playoffs. The Sabres finished 38, 28, and 14 for 90 points, stepped down from last year, but they did bounce back from their sluggish start, finishing 3rd in the Adams division, and they had a chance at revenge as their first-round opponents for the second straight year, the Quebec Nordiques. This time, all 3, Perreault, Andreychuk, and Foligno, were healthy. In Game 1, the Sabres, however, ran into red-hot Mario Gosselin in net, and the Nords' top guns came out firing, and they would drop the first game, 5-2. Dave was held off the score sheet to boot. Game 2 was full of fights and scraps between the two rivals. North star Michel Goulet struck first in the first period, but Foligno was quick to tie it less than a minute later, and it remained 1-1 after 1. The second period was tight-knit, but Brent Ashton late scored the only goal of the period. The Nordiques lead 2-1 after 2. Time was ticking down, but our hero sets up Phil Housley, and the game is tied with 5:32 remaining. But literally 41 seconds later, Norm Rochford scores, and the Nordiques hold on for a 3-2 win. The Sabres are on the verge of getting swept for the second straight year. The series shifts to Buffalo for Game 3, and the Sabres were down 2-1 going into the third period. And goals from Bill Hatt and Paul Cyr, they led 3-2 with a goal scored just 2:17 apart, but 31 seconds later the Nords tied it, and 7 minutes later took the lead. With 3:05 remaining, the Sabres saved their season with a John Tucker goal tying it, and then 40 seconds later, Dave Andreychuk scores, and the auditorium erupts as the Sabres have the lead and ice it with an empty netter by Rick Sealing. The Sabres stave off elimination with our hero scoring the game winner. What a wild final period. Game 4, the fans are amped at the odd, but the Nordiques lead 3-2 after 2. Perreault tied the game 37 seconds into the third, and just over 3 minutes later, Dave scores, and the Sabres have the lead at 4-3. Just over 4 minutes later, he scores again. The Sabres have a 2-goal lead. Ashton gets the Nords back within 1, but 1:03, Dave gets the hat trick with a solo effort, the first hat trick of his career, and it couldn't have come at a better time. And Sealing with 2 seconds left, ices the game yet again, and the Sabres win 7-4. Back-to-back 5-goal third periods at home, and the series is tied 2-2, and our hero is the hero of this game. What an outstanding performance. The fifth and deciding game is in Quebec, and what a game it would be. Goulet struck first for Quebec, but the dangerous Buffalo power play saw Dave set up Lindy Ruff for a goal, and then Perreault notches a power play goal of his own, and then scores his second of the game. It's 3-1, but just over 2 minutes apart, the Nords strike with 2 goals late in the period. It's tied 3-3 after the first. The Sabres scored the only goal of the second, however, as Rick Sealing gives them a 4-3 lead after 40 minutes. Just 1:27 into the third, Housley made it 5-3, and the Sabres were cruising, but then just at the midway point, the Nords scored 2 quick goals just over a minute apart, and just like that, the game is tied. Neither can solve the other's goaltender. It looks like we could be heading to OT, but with 1:09 to play, Brent Ashton makes an individual effort, singing the hearts of Sabres and their fans. They can't tie the game, try as they might. The Nordiques take the fifth and deciding game. Despite that disappointment, Dave had an excellent series. The best he had looked in any playoff series he has ever had, with 7 points in 5 games and a +4, plus his first ever hat trick in a huge Game 4 performance. But the Sabres dropped back-to-back first-round losses to the Nords, despite a much more spirited effort this year. Dave had 31 goals and 30 assists for 61 points in 64 games, missing 16 due to injury. Not quite as good as last year, but be that as it may, he was huge on the power play, which is why he clicked so well again with Perreault, as well as John Tucker and Phil Housley, who were all key on that unit. But Dave, his wealth spread out. 19 players assisted on his goals. He assisted on the goals of 14 different players and collaborated with 16 different players on assists. For the second straight year, despite missing 16 games, he led the Sabres in goals and was tied for 9th in the NHL with 14 power play goals. He did slip from a big +20 last year to a slightly disappointing -5, but scored his first career hat-trick in a playoff game win over the Nordiques, and had a great showing in the series despite the loss. His popularity in Buffalo was continuing to rise. By the time the 1985-86 season started, the Sabres were seen as a club that had become stagnant in their progression, as Scotty Bowman hired a new coach to again focus on management duties. He hired Jim Schoenfeld, a former defenseman for the club and someone Bowman had coached. Dave looked sharp to begin the season, however, with a 3-point night and a loss to Hartford, and followed that up with a 2-goal game over the Minnesota North Stars, and stayed consistent for the most part. The Sabres, however, did look sharp early on in the season, but Andreychuk hit a bad slump in November. But he bounced back with a 3-point night and a win over the Nordiques on November 22nd. And at that point, they were doing pretty good, at 12-7-1. But the struggles began with a 4-game losing streak. The Sabres just couldn't seem to get on track as the New Year's approached. Rumors of Schoenfeld's coaching status were flying. Some said the players weren't communicating, and vice versa with him. Others said again Bowman had the issue. In a New Year's Eve game against Boston with 2 goals and 2 assists for 4 points, Dave had a huge night. But the Sabres let a 6-3 lead collapse, and giving up 3 goals in the span of 1:23 late in the third period, had to settle for a tie. Schoenfeld was fired after a 4-2 loss to the Chicago Blackhawks. as the team sat at 19-19-5, which really shouldn't be that big of a deal, but there was a problem. You see the perennially bad Hartford Whalers? They were good this year. And now past the halfway point of the season, Buffalo found themselves competing for the usually easy-to-grab fourth playoff spot in the Adams division. And now Bowman was back behind the bench. Somerville Bowman had lost control of this team, and there wasn't much faith in him from team owners, the Knox brothers. Not to mention that great power play the Sabres had the year prior had plummeted. The Sabres were still simply average and not really progressing. However, on February 6, 1986, they were on the road for a huge divisional game against the Boston Bruins. 37 seconds into the game, Mike Foligno scored. And 7 minutes later, Dave scores on a setup from Mike Ramsey. And almost 7 minutes later, Dave scores again. It's 3-0 for the Sabres. The Bruins would get 2 back, however, and it would be 3-2 Sabres after 1. But on the power play early in the second period, Dave scores his first career hat trick in the regular season. Wow! The Bruins close the gap again, and 1:43 later, Dave scores again. That's 4 goals. Oh man, what a huge night! And again, the Bruins get 1 back. But then Andreychuk then sets up Norm Lacombe on the power play. A 5-point night. A career high in goals and points. And wait. Hey, he scores again? 5 goals. A monster night for Big Dave. A 6-point night, including 5 goals en route to an 8-6 win. Oh, wow. 5 goals in 1 game, a very rare feat, and to this day stands as the Sabres' franchise record, and he tied for second best with 6 points in a game. And Dave would get a hero's welcome 3 days later and overshadow the arrival of Wayne Gretzky and the Oilers to Buffalo and receive much adulation for his performance. Dave continued to play well, but the team still couldn't catch fire. Perreault, while playing well, was finally starting to show some of his age, was now in his 16th season. And with 3 games left, the Sabres were still out of the playoffs, as they squared off against the very team they were trying to catch, the Hartford Whalers, on April 1st. They were tied at 78 points in the standing, but the Whalers had more wins, and the Sabres desperately needed this one to keep their playoff hopes alive. And wouldn't you know it, they'd actually built a 3-1 lead after Foligno scored his 40th goal of the season. But 40 seconds later, Kevin Dineen scores, and late in the period, Stu Gavin scored, and it's 3-3 after 2. Early in the third period, resident knuckle-dragger and outright coward Ulf Samuelsson scored to give the Whalers the lead. And then Dineen scored his second with 1:28 to go. And the Whalers won 5-3. This was a bad loss for the Sabres, and Dave was pointless. Their last 2 games of the season were a home and home with the Montreal Canadiens, and Dave came up big for the Sabres with a goal and an assist and a huge win since the Whalers had lost the night before. Each team had 80 points, but the Sabres just had one game remaining, while the Whalers still had 2, but the race was still tight. So it was a must-win for the Sabres, and they needed the Whalers to lose both games, but it was not to be. They dropped the 4-2 loss to the Habs in Montreal. Dave was scoreless and a -1, while the Whalers won both their final games, so it wouldn't have mattered either way. The Buffalo Sabres missed the playoffs despite a 37-37-6 records, missing the playoffs for the first time in 12 seasons. Dave's season, however, wasn't quite over. He accepted the invitation to play for Team Canada at the 1986 World Ice Hockey Championships. He was joined by Mike Foligno and backup goaltender Jacques Cloutier on Team Canada, but more Sabres were representing Team USA, such as star goalie Tom Barrasso, Mike Ramsey, Richie Dunn, and another all-star, Phil Housley. Dave scored 3 goals and 2 assists for 5 points as Canada won a bronze medal, so the season wasn't a total loss for our hero. Dave had 36 goals and 51 assists for a career-high 87 points. His chemistry with Housley continued, who assisted on 10 of Dave's goals, more than a quarter, while he assisted on 11 of his 31 goals, more than a third. And the two collaborated on 9 assists as lines were being shuffled all through the season and was being shifted with Perreault, while not all that much, but still saw a lot of ice time alongside Foligno. His career-high 87 points allowed him to lead the team in points and assists for the first time in his career. His historic 5-0 game against the Bruins on February 6th is still a team record that stands as of the end of 2021-2022. He improved to a +3, and while the Sabres missed the playoffs, he was able to obtain a bronze medal in the 1986 World Ice Hockey Championships. Things were looking very bleak going into 1986-87, as many felt Bowman's direction was, truly lost, and that he had hurt the team more than he had helped in recent years. On paper, it also wasn't looking very good for the Sabres either, because the Hartford Whalers, a longtime perennial basement dweller, had become quite a good team. And boy did it show how bad things would get. The Sabres would not get off to a good start, and Dave wasn't playing very well either. The team started 3-7-2, and Bowman found himself stepping away from the bench. Later, former Sabres star Craig Ramsay took over. Dave had back-to-back 3-point games, however, shortly after that, and started a 6-game point streak, but it ended with a 5-game scoreless streak afterwards. Also, Sabres icon and team captain and future Hall of Famer Gilbert Perreault retired early in the season after 17 total seasons. Also, Bowman found himself let go from Buffalo completely by December. Finished as general manager after 8 seasons, and Jerry Meehan took over. The team wasn't improving under Ramsay, and after an overtime loss to the Leafs on December 20th, his time as coach was done as well. And then Ted Sater, who had been recently fired by the New York Rangers, took over. Dave was playing decently, but the team was 7-22-4 at the time of Sater's hiring. Dave, however, was still more consistent than every other Buffalo forward, as even Foligno struggled in many games. The team was at least showing signs of life under Sater, and while their power play was weak, Dave was still their top forward on the extra man advantage. The highlight for Dave's year was a 3-point night and a huge upset over Wayne Gretzky and the Edmonton Oilers, where he assisted on the overtime winning goal scored by Scott Arniel. He would have 2 more 4-point nights in March with a win over Quebec and a loss to Toronto, but the Sabres finished 8 points behind the Nordiques for the final playoff spot and would miss the postseason yet again with a horrendous 28-44-8 record for 64 points, the team's first losing record since 1973-74. Dave scored 25 goals and 48 assists for 73 points, and again it was John Tucker he clicked with the most, despite Tucker missing 26 games. But he did also show some great chemistry with Finnish import and rookie Christian Ruutu. For the second straight year, he led the team in points and assists, and had 13 power play goals, was among the top 20 in the league in that category. But it was a rough year for the Sabres overall, and a second straight year without a playoff berth. Also, Dave didn't participate in the Ice Hockey World Championships. Into the 1987-88 season, the Sabres were preparing to build a whole new future around young players. As along with Christian Ruutu, they had 3 new young Lions join the team: Ray Shepard, defenseman Kalle Johansson, and first overall pick, Pierre Turgeon. Dave himself had only just turned 24 years old and was entering his 6th season. But now he was carrying a whole new load into the regular season, as now that Perreault was gone, he was considered the top forward on the team, which can shoulder a very heavy burden. But with Jerry Meehan as the full-time GM and Ted Sater returned as the team's head coach, the team looked pretty solid. Despite struggling in certain aspects of the game, they were still able to accumulate some wins, and were 9-7-4 in their first 20 games, and Dave had 19 points in those 20 games. The young players were coming together, and the Sabres were finding ways to win, even though they weren't dominating. They were showing that they possessed a great deal of talent. Dave had his second career regular season hat trick in his team's 6-3 win over the Quebec Nordiques on December 3rd. Dave had another huge night on January 6, 1988 against the Montreal Canadiens, as the Sabres were being dominated 3-0 when Dave scored to break the shutout with 1:24 to go in the first period. The Sabres found themselves down 5-2 after 2, but Ray Shepard scored, but the Sabres didn't get anything going until on the power play at the midway point our hero strikes again. It's a 2-goal game, and Scott Arniel tied the game with 58 seconds to play, but with 11 seconds to go, Dave Andreychuk is set up by Scott Arniel to give the Sabres a massive win over the first-place Habs. A huge comeback anchored by our hero. The Sabres will continue to fight for a return to the playoffs and his second hat-trick of the year. And the Sabres were in the midst of being unbeaten in 11 of 13 games during this point. A month later, on February 6th, Dave had his third hat-trick of the year in losing cause against the New York Islanders. The Sabres scratched and clawed throughout the year, but it paid off. They finished with a 37-32-11 record, good enough for 85 points and third place in the Adams Division, and they were set to return to the playoffs. Standing in their way would be a team that didn't quite slip as far down as they did in recent years, but came pretty close: the Boston Bruins, who have picked themselves up this year with 94 points. Their team consisted of young star power forward Cam Neely now. Veteran two-way star Rick Middleton was still there, along with Steve Kasper, Craig Janney, and in goal you had veteran Reggie Lemelin and former Oilers star Andy Moog. And a top-notch defense made up of Reed Larson, Gord Kluzak, Glenn Wesley, and of course two-time Norris Trophy winner, including that very year, Ray Bourque. The last time these two faced was that 1983 epic 7-game series in Dave's rookie year. Game 1 took place in Boston and was a brawl fest with nearly 150 penalty minutes. It was tied 1-1 after the first period, but Boston ran away with the game, taking a 4-1 lead in what would end up being a 7-3 win. Game 2 sees 100-plus penalty minutes as Neely continues to run wild and the Sabres drop this one 4-1. Dave has assists in both games. Down 2 games and going home to Buffalo, it was looking bleak yet again. The penalties were crazy yet again, but this time it was the Sabres who dished out a thrashing. Dave, Foligno, and Christian Ruutu were all on fire in a 6-2 win. They're still in this thing. A wild outing in Game 4, the Sabres find themselves 2-1 late in the second, but our hero scores his first goal of the series and ties the game. The third period is chaotic. Tucker and Turgeon score. It's 4-2. But wait, Middleton and Neely score less than 2 minutes apart and we're tied. 13 seconds after the tie, Housley scores. The Sabres lead 5-4, but with 1:33 to go, Cam Neely scores. It's 5-5 and we're off to OT. But just over 5.5 minutes in on the power play, Tucker, who has been having an epic series, scores the overtime winner, and the Sabres have tied the series. We shift back to Boston. In Game 5, the Sabres find themselves down 2-0 in the second period, but then Ruutu and then Dave, they score. It's tied 2-2 after 2. Another wild third period as Linsman and McCarty score. 4-2 Bruins, but Tucker scores to close the gap to 4-3. 3 minutes later, however, Middleton restores the Bruins' 2-goal lead. Shepard scores on a power play with 3:02 to keep the Sabres in it, but they just can't get that equalizer, and they head back home on the verge of elimination, down 3-2. Be that as it may, Game 6, the crowd at the Odd is amped up in sight. The Sabres were hoping to force a Game 7, but the Bruins were up 3-0 in the first period and never looked back. A 5-2 win, winning the series at 6 games. The Bruins were simply the better team, that's all there was to it. The Sabres were still a rebuilding club with a lot of maturing players. They played some great games in the series, while Dave himself had a decent series, with 2 goals, 4 assists to 6 points in 6 games, and a -2. With his 30 goals and 48 assists for 78 points, Dave was again grooving with John Tucker as well as Mike Foligno, assisting on nearly half his goals that season, and the two collaborated on 8 assists. For the third straight season, Dave led his team in points and assists, and still a heavyweight on the power play, with half his goals coming on the extra man advantage, and finished with a +1. He also proved he could lead a team, and was growing as a tremendous leader all around. Turgeon was being built as the finesse star of the future, but Dave was still proving he's integral to this team and its future. Going into the 1988-89 season, there were high hopes for this young Sabres team, as they were still being led by Jerry Meehan as GM and coached by Ted Sater. Dave missed the first 3 games of the season due to injury, but then he returned with a vengeance with a hat trick and 2 assists for a 5-point night against Mario Lemieux and the Pens. After amassing 21 points in 21 games, Dave suffered a terrible knee injury in a win over the Philadelphia Flyers on November 27, 1988, and would miss 21 games. In that time, however, Buffalo was still so-so in his absence with a 9-9-3 record, par for the course in what has been a mediocre year so far. Dave returned in a 3-3 tie against the North Stars and would go on a 4-game goal streak, and the Sabres were starting to look like a better team after his return. Dave would not miss a game the rest of the season, would play fairly well, but you can see his knee injury still had an effect on him. But after his return, the Sabres went 19-14-2 to finish the season, and the team would finish 38-35-7 for 83 points, just a point less than the year prior. The team made a bold move during this season, trading young defensive star Calle Johansson. And while they got a talented goalie with Clint Malarchuk in return, the trade seemed very one-sided. This was also the year they lost Tom Barrasso to the Pittsburgh Penguins, but Darren Pupa, yes, that's his real name, was playing very well. Anyway, this meant the Sabres would have to deal with the Bruins again in the playoffs. The Bruins had made it to the finals the year prior, and Buffalo was the first team they beat on their path. But this year they'd only finished 5 points ahead of the Sabres. Game 1 was a huge shocker. The Sabres decimated the Bruins in Boston by a score of 6-0. Dave had an assist in the win. In Game 2, the Sabres looked to do the unthinkable, as after a scoreless first period, they were suddenly up 3-0, but they collapsed. The Bruins shrunk the lead by scoring 2 goals later in the second period, and then 3 in the third for a 5-3 win to tie the series, as the next 2 games were in Buffalo. In the third period of Game 3, Buffalo found themselves down 2-0 thanks to a red-hot goaltending performance by Andy Moog, but around the midway point, Rick Vaive and Phil Housley shocked the star goalie with 2 goals, just half a minute apart. But Cam Neely scores a power play goal, and with just 1 second left, the Bruins score an empty netter to take a 4-2 win, and the series lead 2-1. The Sabres had a 2-1 lead in Game 4, but again let it slip, and the Bruins defense held it down and they hung on for a 3-2 win, putting the Sabres on the verge of elimination. Going into Game 5, the Sabres were heavily criticized by the local sports media, and Dave was among those who again took the brunt of criticism. He had yet to score a goal. Well, he wouldn't on this night either, and once again the Sabres would lose to the Bruins for the second straight year, this time in 5 games. Dave was not playing well, but neither was anyone else really. No goals, 3 assists, and an even 0. But young sophomore forward Pierre Turgeon was the only one that really stood out in this series. Dave missed 24 games, and he had 28 goals and 24 assists for 52 points in 56 games. Once again, despite his own injury issues over the last few seasons, his scoring touch diminishing, John Tucker was a huge part of Dave's presence as a player yet again this season, assisting on close to half his goals. While he also collaborated on 6 assists with Dave and a quarter of Dave's helpers. All the while, Dave was key in Pierre Turgeon's breakout year to boot. After missing so many games, it was the first time since his rookie year he didn't lead the team in any category, really, and the Sabres are still marred in mediocrity and haven't won a playoff series since Dave's rookie season. GM Jerry Meehan was not content to settle for mediocrity and was ready to shake things up. However, he did already have a talented core on the ice, so his main concern was coaching. He felt Ted Sater wasn't getting much of them, and his time in Buffalo after 2 seasons was finished. He then hired Rick Dudley, a former Sabres left winger, who was on the verge of becoming an NHL star as he was a huge part of the Sabres' 1974-75 club, then went to the Cup Finals, but defected to the WHA, where he had a successful 4-season tenure with the Cincinnati Stingers. He returned to the Sabres in '78 to play 3 seasons, but wasn't the same player. He ended his career with a stint with the lowly Winnipeg Jets team and a stay in the minors. After his retirement, he did, however, become a successful coach in the AHL and IHL, and was now ready for the pros as the Sabres were determined to become a much better team. They already look great on paper. Up front, you have Dave, Turgeon, Shepard, Foligno, Ruutu, Tucker, and veteran Rick Vive, as well as a rookie, Alexander McGillney. And on defense, you had the strong core of Housley, Ramsey, veteran Jay Wells, Doug Bodger, the towering UA Crew, and Grant Ledyard. And to top it off in net, you had Darren Pupa. Dave was entering his 8th season in the NHL, and while he was beloved by the Sabres faithful, some felt he wasn't getting the respect he deserved, simply because his goals weren't the prettiest, and he wasn't the best skater. Despite being a top forward to the club, he was never selected to any All-Star game, which had many puzzled. His pro international experience was limited to just 1 World Ice Hockey Championship, and again, participating in those tournaments may have likely been his decision whether to do so or not. However, his name barely came up in conversation for the 1987 Canada Cup. He was a hard worker who scores goals and could get the job done on the power play. Was a great leader, but in a league that would sometimes have a dozen or even more 100-point players, he was overshadowed by many, including some of his own teammates. And now Pierre Turgeon was in that category, but of course he earned it. That's not a slight on Turgeon. The Sabres started the season with a decent 5-4-1 record. In those first 10 games, Dave had 10 points. However, in the next 10, he had 12 points. And in those 10 games, the Sabres went on a 9-game unbeaten streak and were red hot in the Adams division. Rick Dudley's coaching methods were working, and the team was looking sharp, finally looking like a tried-and-true threat in the Adams division, even playing better than last year's Stanley Cup finalists, the Montreal Canadiens. Sabres fandom was growing like a wildfire this season, and the team was 23-11-6 after 40 games. Going into the new year, the Sabres had a good lead in first place. But they had also lost their previous 2 games, which sadly led to a 6-game losing streak. And at that time, the Bruins were hot and would take over first place by 3 points. However, at long last, on January 21st, Dave finally achieved a mark that many felt he should have had already. His first appearance at an NHL All-Star game alongside teammates Pierre Turgeon, goaltender Darren Pupa, and longtime teammate and defenseman Phil Housley. And Dave would obtain an assist in the game, and he was also having an excellent year all around. Dave would miss 6 games due to injury and another later on as a scratch, but the Sabres were well on their way, still chasing the Bruins for first place. But sadly, they'd fall just short of 3 points to end the year. But on the final game of the season on April 1st, 1990, the Sabres were facing a lowly Nordiques team as an easy win indeed. They would win the game 5-2, but Dave scored his 40th goal of the season, his first ever 40-goal season, another first-time accomplishment. The Sabres finished 45, 27, and 8 for 98 points. Their best season since 1983-84. Second place in the Adams division, also for the first time since 83-84 they finished that high. And the third best record in the entire league. Sabres fans were psyched at last their fortunes were going to change. It looked as if long last, years of losing and average play was over. Their playoff test, however, wasn't going to be an easy one. It would be the Montreal Canadiens, who the year prior made the Stanley Cup Finals, but finished with 22 points less than they had the year before, but still won over 40 games, and were just 5 points behind Buffalo. And they had a ton of playoff experience on that team. The two teams hadn't faced each other since that huge upset in 1983, which was the last playoff series win for the Sabres. Game 1, it's a sellout crowd at the odd, and the fans are ready. Pupa is sensational net, and the first period ends with no score, but in the second period, Dean Kennedy strikes first for the Sabres, but the Habs tie it just over a minute later. Just over 2 minutes after that, veteran Rick Vive gives them the lead back, and with 52 seconds left in the period, Dave scores at 3-1 Buffalo after 2. Pupa remains outstanding the rest of the way, and net on the third. En route to a 4-1 Buffalo win, they take the first game. Both goaltenders in Game 2 are superb, but Pupa is bombarded again. And this time, however, he lets a few in, while Patrick Waugh does not, and the Sabres are shut out 3-0 at home. The series is tied. We go to Montreal for Game 3. The skills of Waugh and Pupa are both on display, and at the end of regulation, each team only has a goal. And we're off to a thrilling overtime where 12:35 in, Scrudland, no stranger to overtime goals, gives the Habs the win and the series lead. And the media is out again to attack the Sabres. However, in Game 4, our hero comes out to play. Down 1-0 early in the second, he and Turgeon set up 5 on the power play. It's tied. But Scrudland once again strikes. Another dagger to give the Habs their lead back. But then Dave, along with Housley, sets up Bodger to tie the game. And then Dave, to Vive, to Turgeon. He scores with 3 seconds left in the period. The Sabres lead 3-2 after 2. And just over a minute in the third period, Housley to Dave, to Turgeon. He scores a second of the game as the Sabres go on to win 4-2. The big guns came out shooting on this one. Huge games for Turgeon, Vive, and Housley. And also our hero was in on all 4 goals with 4 assists. A huge response to tie this series. Game 5, we're back in Buffalo where the Sabres can take control of the series, but Patrick Waugh shines in net, and the Sabres are having trouble getting anything together. And while they did lead 2-1 in the second, Bobby Smith and Stefan Richer score 1-12 apart late in the second, and Buffalo stayed in it, however. But Russ Courtnall notched an empty netter as Buffalo tried as they might. The Habs now have the Sabres' dream season on the verge of ending. Game 6 back in Montreal, the Sabres look good. And while the Habs strike first in the opening period, 1:22 later, Vive scores and the game is tied again, 1-1. It's still tied late in the second period, but the Habs get another one and lead 2-1 after 2. They go up 3-1 early in the third, but 1:20 later, Dave scores. It's cut to 3-2, but just 2:41 later, Courtnall strikes them again to restore their 2-goal lead, and as the empty netter, the Sabres are eliminated. The season they had worked so hard to accomplish ends yet again with another first-round loss. Dave plays well, but not well enough. Despite his awesome Game 4 performance and leading his team in scoring with 7 points and was a +2, the Sabres still can't get the job done. Dave did have a huge year with 40 goals and 42 assists for 82 points in 73 games. And it was he and Pierre Turgeon who were on a line switched out with either Foligno or Vive on the right wing, and they were a destructive force. Turgeon assisted on just over half of Dave's 40 goals, with 21, while Dave himself assisted on 18 of Turgeon's 40, nearly half, and they collaborated on 10 assists together. It should be noted Phil Housley also clicked with these two in a huge way. Dave's 40 goals were a career high, and tied the team lead with Turgeon. He also finished with a +6, had 18 power play goals, tied for 7th in the league. He played in his first NHL All-Star game and came in 4th in All-Star team voting, the first time he received any votes in that category. He was also named interim captain when Mike Foligno missed several games, and despite the playoff disappointment, it was a huge career year once again for Dave. Though Jerry Meehan and Rick Dudley were not happy about the first-round exit, and many felt that Meehan might react and fire Dudley. So many players faced persecution for their playoff performances, especially Turgeon, and even Dave was once again a target, even though he was the most productive forward of the series. But it looked like nobody took it worse than Phil Housley in their offseason. On the date of the 1990 NHL entry draft, a huge blockbuster trade was made. After 8 big seasons in Buffalo, Phil Housley was traded to the Winnipeg Jets, along with Scott Arniel and Jeff Parker and a first-round draft pick, which ended up being Keith Tkachuk that year, in exchange for their first-round draft pick, which ended up being fan-favorite knuckle-dragger Brad May, but superstar center Dale Hawerchuk. Dale was disgruntled after 9 seasons in Winnipeg, but brings to Buffalo 6 100-point seasons and an experienced center to perhaps play alongside Turgeon to help him progress. This was huge. The Sabres had sent John Tucker to the Capitals last season, but they brought him back feeling he could still add depth and gave the Capitals some cash in exchange. They also parted with Ray Shepherd to the Rangers for more cash. He hadn't panned out like they'd hoped. Despite an excellent rookie campaign in 87-88, his production had dropped. And he had spent some time in the minors, but actually would go on to have a really good career. And just about a week before the season was about to start, they obtained defenseman Bill Hulder, as well as Finnish big man Mikko Mäkelä, who had some pretty decent seasons with the New York Islanders. Going into 1990-91, it was an uncertain time. The year didn't start off well for the Sabres, and after 10 games, they were 2-5-3. Dave had only 7 points and was a -1. However, the next 10 games, the Sabres were getting it together, and Dave would have 10 points in those 10 games. But you could see the team was desperately missing Phil Housley, as Buffalo's defense was faltering in many games. Dave was being used to contribute more defensively as well, and was good in the role that he had. But you could see that Turgeon was exposed in that aspect of defensive play, while Andreychuk, having more defensive skills than Turgeon, was pretty much becoming the team's top center, as many felt he had a lot more depth. Dave played several good games and had many 2-goal and 3-point games. And on December 17, 1990, something insane happened. After 10 seasons in Buffalo, Mike Foligno saw his scoring production drop significantly. He was sent to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for a tough guy Lou Franceschetti and another tough guy in Brian Curran. John Tucker was traded yet again in the new year, this time to the New York Islanders, and only this time he wouldn't come back. On March 5, 1991, the NHL's trade deadline arrived, and they obtained veteran goaltender Steve Weeks from Vancouver and Tony Tanti from the Penguins, who was actually an all-star in Vancouver at one point. The Sabres finished 31, 30, and 19 for 81 points, a far cry from last season, and we're back to third in the Adams division to finish 8 points back of the second-place Habs. So here we go again. Game 1 took place in Montreal. It was a brawl fest. They found themselves down 5-2 early in the second period. The Habs took a 7-3 lead by the third period. The Sabres would get back a couple. It was too late. They dropped Game 1. The Sabres did much better in Game 2 and even had a 4-3 lead in the period, but Stéphane Richer tied it with 1:21 to go. Guy Carbonneau scores the game winner. Habs take both games at home. Now for Game 3 in Buffalo, it's back and forth. Buffalo led 2-1 early in the game, but found themselves down 3-2 in the first. It took a 4-3 lead in the second, but Montreal tied it later on in the frame. It's 4-4 after 2. But the game winner is scored early in the frame by Mike Ramsey, and the Sabres are still in this thing. In Game 4, still at the odd, the Habs took a 2-0 lead early, but the Sabres roared back with 3 goals to take a 3-2 lead to end the first. They took a 5-2 lead in the second period, but the Habs closed the gap to a goal at 5-4 as the period ended. But Dale scored on the power play in the third, and that's all she wrote. The Sabres win 6-4 to tie the series. Our hero, who has been heavily criticized for his play, has a goal and an assist. Game 5 shifts back to Montreal, and Montreal again takes an early 2-0 lead, but by early in the second period, Buffalo goes back to tie it, but Montreal would lead 3-2 after 2. The time is winding down with the Sabres on the power play. It's Haller to McGinley to Dave, who scores with 3:05 to play in regulation. Oh, the game is tied. We're going to OT, but Russ Cornwell comes back again to haunt the Sabres. He scores in the extra frame, and the Habs, once again for the second straight year, could take the Sabres out in 6. And that's exactly what happened. The Sabres put on an embarrassing performance and lose 5-1 at home. Been there, done that. They're mercilessly booed off the ice. Dave was lackluster with just 4 points in the series and was a -2, as both he and Turgeon were scapegoats of the media and the city's fans. The Buffalo faithful who loved Dave were starting to turn against him after yet another first-round exit. Dave had 36 goals and 33 assists for 69 points in 80 games. Not a bad year, but not near as good as the year before. And lo and behold, Dave gelled equally with both star centers. Turgeon assisted on a third of Dave's goals with 12, yet Dale was second with 11. A third of Dave's assists that year were to Dale, but Turgeon was second with 5 helpers from Dave. And the two tied for assist collaborations. The Andreychuk experiment seemed to work on many ends. Dave was still impressive as his 36 goals led the team, a feat he has now accomplished 4 times. His 13 power play goals got him again in the top 20 in the league. He also finished with an impressive +11 and was now becoming the target of a frustrated fan base and the media. Dave was barely even in the conversation once again for the 1991 Canada Cup and was overlooked. Turgeon was actually cut from the team, while Dale Andreychuk made the team. The Sabres were once again just a mediocre club, again going into the 1991-92 season. And Dave Howard was named one of the official alternate captains of the club, after being an interim alternate and even an interim captain in the past. However, every frustrated fan and every media pundit needs someone to blame, and he and Turgeon were the two. And this season wouldn't help at first. Dave was off to a terrible start, with just 2 points in 8 games and was a -3. The Sabres were 2-5-1 when they made a mega blockbuster trade on October 25th. The Sabres were able to acquire a 4th-round draft pick, grinding 20-goal scoring for Randy Wood, and veteran defenseman Randy Hillier, and all-star center Pat LaFontaine from the New York Islanders, and they send Uwe Krupp, Benoit Hogue, Dave McLean, and Pierre Turgeon to the Isles. This trade flabbergasted many and pleased just as many, as seen as they felt LaFontaine again had a lot more depth with Turgeon and now have 2 deathful veteran centers with a scoring touch to boot in both LaFontaine and Andreychuk. Pat was now in his 9th season, and since his 3rd season in the league, he hasn't scored any less than 30 goals, including reaching 40 goals plus 4 consecutive times. He has also reached 100 points and 50 goals in his career. He has also been the top Islanders forward the past 5 seasons. The Sabres were still a so-so team, and the crowds were violently turning against Dave. He only had 6 points in 20 games. However, he finally broke out of his slump in a huge way, scoring a hat-trick in a losing cause to the Boston Bruins and would have 10 points in 6 games, but fell into a slump again with 2 points in 8 games, and the trade rumors started swirling. And to boot, Rick Dudley was fired after the team's 9-15-4 start. But Dave played an epic game against the Bruins once again, this time in a win, an 8-1 thrashing with 2 goals, 3 assists for 5 points. All of the big guns came out flying for this one, combining for 13 points. And our new head coach, John Muckler, the Sabres at least had some direction. Dave carried his momentum into the new year as Muckler emphasized the Sabres' presence on the power play and had the best unit in the lead. And who was it led by? You guessed it, our hero. He was rolling after his really bad start. A 4-point night and a win over Edmonton, a 5-point game and a tie with the Devils, and another one with a win over the Capitals as well. Dave went on a 15-game point streak, and in 21 games between the December 27th win over Boston and February 9th loss to LA, the Sabres went 11-6-4, and Dave had 43 points, averaging just over 2 points a game. Dave continued to perform superbly, as with back-to-back wins over expansion San Jose and the Whalers in February, he had a combined 7 assists. And on March 22nd, in a win over the LA Kings, he had a 5-point night, including 4 goals, where Wayne Gretzky was held pointless. Going into an April 12th game against the first-place division rivals Montreal Canadiens, Dave Andreychuk was sitting at 39 goals and 48 assists for 87 points. Those 87 points were a career high that he has set in 85-86. With Buffalo leading 1-0 in the first period, Dave puts them up 2-0 with his 40th goal of the year, tying a career high, reaching 40 for a second time, and his 88th point, a career best. But late in the third, up 2-1 on the power play, Dave scores another extra man marker, a career high, 41 goals. The Sabres, however, finished the year 31-37-12, a pretty miserable record despite bolstering the league's best power play and being an offensively potent team. However, their weak defense and struggling goaltenders, and they again finished in third place. But speaking of career high, Dave at long last led the NHL with a monster 28 power play goals, while teammate Pat LaFontaine came in third with 23. And you know the story. In the opening round, they encountered the Boston Bruins, and again, we're heavy underdogs. Game 1 took place in Boston. Defenseman Peter Savoda, who Buffalo acquired from Montreal that season, scored late to open the first period up. In the second period, goals by LaFontaine and Bodger were both assisted by our hero, and the Sabres led 3-0. The Bruins got 2 back in the third, but Sabres goalie Tom Draper held them in the rest of the way, and Buffalo shocks Boston in the opening game. Game 2, it was the Bruins who took a 2-0 lead this time, but LaFontaine scored in the second, and Wayne Presley in the third. It's tied 2-2, and we're off to OT. Draper is standing on his head, but the Sabres aren't getting any chances, but Adam Oates puts the OT winner in. The Bruins tie this series as we head to Buffalo for the next 2 games. Here we go. Once again, the Bruins take a 2-0 lead in the first period, and the Sabres come back to tie it. In the second period, however, and in 39 seconds left of the frame, Oates strikes again, and the Sabres had nothing going for them in the third period, and the Bruins take a series lead. Next, Game 4 in Buffalo is a thrill ride, and the Bruins lead 1-0, then the Sabres lead 2-1, then the Bruins lead 3-2, then they extend it to 4-2, but Dave comes through and closes the gap to a goal. Early in the third, the Sabres tie, and we're up to OT, and 2:08 in. Ted Donato scores and kills the buzz in the odd, and we're on the verge of elimination yet again. Game 5, the Boston Garden faithful are ready to see the series wrapped up. However, Draper is fantastic in net for the Sabres and shuts them down. All it takes is a goal from LaFontaine and Hannon, and the Sabres are still in it. Game 6 in Buffalo, and the odd is going wild, but the Sabres could still be eliminated. From the first period into the second period, Presley, Bodger, LaFontaine, May, Patterson, it's 5-0 Sabres, and leading 6-1 after 2. The Bruins get a couple back, but it really didn't matter. The Sabres destroy the Bruins 9-3. We're going to Game 7. It could finally happen. There's so much momentum on their side heading back to Boston for the 7th and deciding game. Oh, this could be it. They can finally win a first-round series. But the Bruins would lead 1-0 after one. But just 2:07 into the second, LaFontaine scores a shorthanded goal, and the game remains tied 1-1 after 2 period. Leach scores to get the Bruins on an early lead in the third period. Just 1:43 later, Dale scores and it's tied 2-2 with 8:20 to go. Adam Moat sets up Dave Reedus, 3-2 Bruins, but it's okay. The Sabres, they were gonna press. They're gonna press, and Andy Moog is turning everything away. The clock's ticked down. Another first-round exit. Dave is once again heavily criticized for his performance in the playoffs with just a goal and a total of 4 points in 7 games. While Andreychuk and LaFontaine were highly productive, but McGillney was also limited to just 2 games in this series to boot. Dave's career high of 41 goals along with 50 assists with another career high of 91 points. And he and the other top forwards were still a destructive force. Dale Andreychuk assisted on 17 of Dave's goals, while LaFontaine came in second with 16, and McGillney was tied for third with Doug Bodger. Also, Dave assisted on 17 of LaFontaine's goals to lead the way, while he assisted on 14 of McGillney's and 5 of Dale's. And for collaborations, Andreychuk led the way with Dave for 10, while McGillney had 9 and LaFontaine was 7. Career highs in goals and points, but the big story is leading the NHL in power play goals. He also finished in the top 20 among league scoring for the very first time in his career. He came in 4th for year-end All-Star voting and actually amassed some votes for the Lady Byng Trophy for skill and sportsmanship, coming in 11th place. But the playoff woes still continue. Dave had now played 10 seasons, all with the Buffalo Sabres, and the only time they won a playoff series was his rookie year, and he didn't play a single game. Many wondered how a team with Andreychuk, LaFontaine, McGillney, and Dave could falter so badly. Well, despite having talented members on their defense such as Mike Ramsey, Doug Bodger, and Peter Svoboda, many pointed to the departure of Phil Housley, as well as even UA Krupp, as to why their defense hadn't gelled really well recently. Dave had been the target of fans for his playoff showing that off-season. Goaltending was also an issue. Darren Pupa had faltered. Tom Draper played better. The Sabres had trouble in goal, and Jerry Meehan wanted to solve that. He departed with Christian Ruutu, whose production had slipped badly in recent seasons, and he traded him to the Winnipeg Jets for Stefan Beauregard, who did pretty well in the prior season as a backup. But on August 7, 1992, Beauregard would already be traded to the Chicago Blackhawks, along with a 4th-round pick for some guy named Dominic Hasek. We'll see how he'll do in the future. John Muckler, the head coach of the Sabres, was Glenn Sather's right-hand man in Edmonton for nearly a decade. He had 4 rings as his top assistant coach and 1 ring as the eventual head coach of the Oilers and was hoping to bring some glory to Buffalo. Dave was red hot, however, to start the season. Despite a loss to Quebec, he had 3 assists, had a 17-game point streak with a huge 31 points, which also included a 4-goal game and a win over Hartford. The Sabres were decent at 8-7-2, as their defense and goaltending, however, was still somewhat of an issue. It was Dave's best start to any season he had ever played, and it continued. On December 11, 1992, in another win over Hartford, Dave had a 5-point night with 1 goal and 4 assists. But right after that, Dave went on a bit of a scoreless drought, however, of 6 games, but he broke his slump with a vengeance, with back-to-back 3-point nights with wins over the Rangers and the expansion Ottawa Senators. After 40 games, Dave had 53 points. He was well on his way to what would be the best season of his career, but he found himself in a terrible slump in January. 5 points in 10 games. And the Boo Birds were out again in Buffalo, yada yada. On January 31st, 1993, the Sabres hosted Edmonton and dropped an overtime 6-5 loss to the Oilers. Dave had a goal and an assist. The Sabres were 26-20-6 at this point for 58 points. They were having a pretty good season. But Andreychuk's time in Buffalo was finally up. Indeed, on February 2nd, 1993, Dave Andreychuk, along with goaltender Darren Pupa and a 1993 first-round draft pick, were traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs in exchange for superstar goaltender Grant Fuhr and a fifth-round draft pick in 1995. Some Buffalo said Dave had to go. Others said Fuhr wasn't even half the goalie he was at Edmonton back in the 80s. Toronto was in need of further strength on the power play as well as just more goals in general, and it didn't get much stronger in that department than Dave. Many fans, however, were still in shock. In Buffalo, they were sad over the loss of a man in the vein of a working-class hero in their eyes, and they were devastated. But others said he was bringing the team down and pointed to his latest slumps to prove that point. They said they should focus on Andreychuk, LaFontaine, and McGillney. During the 52 games he played in Buffalo that season, he had 29 goals and 32 assists for 61 points. Pat LaFontaine, who was playing on another planet and having a career year at that point, assisted on 16 of Dave's 29 goals. That's more than half. Dave also assisted on 14 of Alexander McGillney's goals, who was also having an insane season at boot. At that point, Alex had 49 goals already. And he and Pat also collaborated on 10 assists while he and Dale Andreychuk were still clicking. Dave was leading the league in power play goals at the time of the trade with 20, and the Sabres were among the leaders in the NHL for goals scored. Dave was having a superb year, but the scoring slump seemed to be a concern, as was his -8 rating. And needing a solid veteran goaltender, as Hasek was playing well, but still finding his footing in some ways in Buffalo, Pupa was badly struggling. Either way, after 11 seasons, Dave's days in Buffalo had come to a sudden end. During the course of Dave's career, the Toronto Maple Leafs had been the laughingstock of the NHL. In the 10 full seasons Dave played with Buffalo, the team had only amassed one season with a .500 record and clinched the playoffs just 5 times, but unlike Buffalo, still had 2 series wins to show for it. However, things were changing in Toronto. The year prior, they made one of the biggest trades in NHL history to acquire who many feel was one of the best all-around players in the game at that time, Doug Gilmour. They also obtained playoff experience with Glenn Anderson, as well as veteran defenseman Jamie McCowan arriving to the team. They had a new player well-versed in Soviet hockey named Nikolai Borshevsky, role players such as Mike Krushelnyski, and Dave would also be reunited with his former teammate, Mike Foligno. They had a talented defense, all-star Dave Ellett, Bob Rouse, veteran Todd Gill, and of course I mentioned Jamie McCowan. In net, they had a red-hot rookie goaltender by the name of Felix Potvin. They now had a capable general manager steering the ship in Cliff Fletcher, who guided the Flames for 19 seasons and has a Stanley Cup ring to show for it. And a new coach, Pat Burns, who came over after 4 winning seasons and a Stanley Cup Finals appearance with the Montreal Canadiens. Gilmour was having an insane season of his own when Dave joined the team, but they were still among the lower tier of the league in goals scored. At the time of the trade, the Leafs were 24-20-8, still their best start in years. Dave made his debut for the Leafs on February 3rd, 1993, just a day after the trade in a game against the New York Islanders. The Leafs were down 3-1 late in the period, but with 4:13 left, Dave scored his first goal not in a Sabres uniform, and it was his 30th of the year, the 8th time he'd reached that mark, with at least 30 in a season. And he kept the Leafs in the game, and unfortunately they were able to obtain the equalizer. Dave, however, did receive a huge reception from Leaf fans upon his arrival, and Leaf fans back in his hometown of Hamilton were proud to have one of their very own play for their team. His jersey, which now they sold more jerseys in stores at this point, was selling like hotcakes. It didn't take long for Dave to adjust to life in Toronto. The team would go on a 10-game unbeaten streak, where Dave would have a 4-point night against the Minnesota North Stars, and 2 3-point nights to boot. On this streak, he had 16 points, working on a line with Gilmour and Borshevsky, occasionally switched out with Glenn Anderson. And when you wear that Toronto jersey and you're racking it up, not to mention you were born just under an hour away, you become an instant god overnight. Dave was absolutely thriving in Toronto as this Leafs team was capturing the spirit and attention of the community. Toronto's power play had improved drastically to boot, and the other top forwards, such as Gilmour, were responding. On March 6, 1993, in a home game against the Winnipeg Jets, Dave scored an insurance goal in a 4-2 Leafs victory. It was his 42nd goal of the year, a new career high. But he would have an even bigger night on March 23rd on the road against the Jets when he scored his 50th goal of the year, the first time he'd ever reached that great achievement, also the 92nd point of the season, a new career high. The Leafs finished 44-29-11 for 99 points. one of the best seasons in franchise history. However, it was only good enough for third place, as they were in the highly competitive Norris Division. Dave had arrived with a vengeance. In the first round of the Norris Division playoffs, the Leafs would have to face the high-powered Detroit Red Wings, who finished 4 points ahead of them in the standings, led of course by a scoring machine and one of the game's best leaders, Steve Yzerman, as well as all-star Sergei Fedorov, legendary defenseman and winner of 4 Stanley Cups, Paul Coffey. He also had high-octane power forward Dino Ciccarelli, a former teammate of Dave's in Ray Shepard, a young promising defenseman named Nick Lidstrom, who's also joined by veteran Mark Howe and Steve Chasson on that core, and all-star goalie Tim Chevalier. Dave still had yet to participate in a series win in his 11-season career, and some felt this was Detroit's time to shine after years of rebuilding. Game 1 takes place from the Joe Louis Arena, and the team split goals. In the first period, it's 1-1 after 1. But Shepard, Burr, Chasson, and Howe all score. It's 5-1 Wings. Gilmore scores with a second left in the second period. It's 5-2 Wings after 2. The Leafs were going to drop this one 6-3. A brutal loss. Game 2 is even worse. Yzerman, Fedorov, Coffey, and Kozlov destroy the Leafs in a 6-2 win, so the Leafs find themselves down 2-0, heading home for the next 2 games. Ah yes, it's the same old story that our hero is used to, just with a different team. And the Leafs, including Dave, are also getting something that he's used to. Critics from the media. But Toronto was a million times more venomous than Buffalo could ever be. But Dave responds. Not 1, but 2 goals in the first period, both assisted by Gilmore, one also assisted by former teammate Foligno in Buffalo. It's 2-0 after 1. The Wings get one back in the second, but in the third period, longtime Leafs fan favorite Wendell Clark scores, as does Rob Pearson, and Leafs lead 4-1, and they take an important 4-2 win to stay in the series. Game 4 is a tight affair with no scoring in the first period, but 8:52 into the first, Sheldon Kennedy puts the Wings on the board. But 1:16 later, Dave scores! The game is tied 1-1, and it would be 2-2 after 2. Early in the third period, it's Anderson to Gilmore to Dave. He scores! Back-to-back 2-goal games for Dave. The Leafs hang on to win thanks to Potvin's goaltending. The series is tied at 2. Oh boy. Game 5 in Detroit. It's another exciting affair. The Wings strike first. Dave keeps his hot streak alive and ties it, but Fedorov gives the Wings a 2-1 lead after 1. It's not looking good. The Wings go up 4-1, but Dave Ellett scores 2 goals. They close the gap to 4-3 to end the second period. But midway through the second, Wendell Clark scores, and the game is tied 4-4. We are up to overtime. But just 2:05 in, Wendell sets up Foligno, who scores, and the Leafs take a 3-2 series lead with a 5-4 win, and Davis hot with a goal and an assist. 6 points in the last 3 games, all of which the Leafs have won. At long last, he could shake this monkey off his back. The years of criticism, the years of first-round exits, as the Leafs get a hero's welcome at Maple Leaf Gardens for Game 6. The Leafs themselves are looking to win their first playoff series since 1987. This could be the first playoff series win Dave has participated in. But the party poopers known as the Wings decimate the Leafs in a 7-3 win. Here we go. Thanks to a hat trick from Ciccarelli and a 4-point night from Coffey. So yes, we're back to Dave's old song and dance once again going into Game 7, and many are banking on the Wings as the series heads back to Detroit. It's tied 1-1 after the first, and Detroit carried a 3-2 lead into the third period, and the Leafs just could not get anything going. The clock winding down, another season of disappointment. The town, its fans, and our hero, and stop the presses! Gilmore scores with 2:43 to play. We're up to overtime. However, just 2:35 in, Borshevsky deflects Rouse's shot. The Leafs win! The Leafs win! And the jubilation across this Leafs team is visible, including our hero who finally wins his first playoff series, as the fans back in Toronto got the CN Tower shaking. Oh boy, what a glorious moment for Dave, and he was fantastic in this series. 6 goals leading the Leafs in that category, with 2 assists for 8 points and a +1, plus 3 straight huge performances to get the Leafs back in this series. He really came in the clutch en route to that Game 7 epic victory. In a weird twist of fate, however, the Sabres also won their first playoff series as well since 1983, with a shocking 4-game sweep over the heavily favored Bruins. Oh boy. For the next round, the Leafs meet the St. Louis Blues, who, like Dave's former team, also shocked many in the playoffs, sweeping the heavily favored Chicago Blackhawks. The Blues, however, were a lot more talented than their record suggested. They didn't have much of a strong defense, however. They had the likes of Brendan Shanahan, Craig Janney, Ron and Rich Sutter. They did have a good defenseman in Jeff Brown, and in the net, you had the amazing Curtis Joseph, and of course, leading the way, megastar Brett Hull. In Game 1, the Maple Leaf Gardens faithful are sight, but Cujo is stopping just about everything coming his way. While the Blues struggle to get to Potvin, John Cullen, however, scores for the Leafs. With 57 seconds left in the first, it's 1-0 in the intermission. Midway through the second period, little-used Philippe Bozon ties to the game for St. Louis, and the rest of the way, Cujo makes epic save after epic save. The Leafs give up nothing either. We are headed to OT, but that solves nothing. We're off to the second OT, but Gilmore, oh boy, showing off his skills with a very legendary goal to give the Leafs the first game. In Game 2, Hull and Gilmore trade goals, but that would literally be it for the rest of regulation, as again, Cujo is just goaltending on another level. We go to overtime again, nothing solved. Now again to double overtime, but this time, the Blues take it as Jeff Brown scores early in that frame, and the series is tied 1-1. We're heading to St. Louis. In Game 3, Dave scores his first goal of the series. Elliott adds another to take a 2-0 lead, but 36 seconds later, Brett Hull scores. It's 2-1 Leafs after one. And in the second period, Shanny scores not one but two goals to put the Blues up 3-2. Krushelnyski ties it for Toronto in the third, but Garth Butcher, of all people, scores near the midway point. Cujo holds them in the rest of the way. The Blues take a 2-1 series lead with a 4-3 win. But hey, in Game 4, the Leafs do not panic, and this time the Blues' lack of defense is exposed at last. Cujo suffers because of it. Dave gets a goal, and the Leafs win 4-1. The series is tied, heading to Toronto. Game 5, Leafs Nation is buzzing, and so are the Leafs themselves. Dave has 2 goals, and Borshevsky a 3-point night. A dominant win for the Leafs of 5-1. They now have the Blues on the verge of elimination. In the crucial Game 6, Dave opens the scoring on a power play, and Potvin is turning everything away, but so is Cujo after that goal. In the third period, Lowry and Brown score, however, with just under 5 minutes apart, and the Blues hang on for a 2-1 game. We're going to a 7th and deciding game once again. But Maple Leaf Gardens is shaking in anticipation. The Leafs respond, and they are just unstoppable on this night. Anderson, Clark, Elliott, Gilmore, Krushelnyski, they're all unstoppable on this night. Potvin has a shutout. Dave has a goal. The Leafs easily take the 7th game 6-0. Oh, they haven't ventured this far into the playoffs since 1978. Dave again plays extremely well with another 6 goals, again leading the Leafs in that category for this series. He added another assist for 7 points and a very good +4, leading the Leafs all the way. After all those playoff woes, he is not only part of a series win at last, but now can play in a conference final. For the first time, he can find his way on the verge of a Stanley Cup. However, his former team, the Sabres, had a cruel twist of fate, being swept out by the Montreal Canadiens in their division final. Oh yes, the Leafs dream season is becoming more and more real, as is Dave's career season, and awaiting them are the Los Angeles Kings. Again, another team many felt there might be better than their record suggests. They scored upsets over Calgary and Vancouver to get here. The Kings had a superb goaltender in Kelly Rudy, a strong defense with Marty McSorley, young Rob Blake, rookie Daryl Sador, and veteran Charlie Huddy. Up front, you had strong role players such as 16-year vet Dave Taylor, Jimmy Carson, and Tony Granato. And leading the way, you had Yari Curry, Thomas Sandstrom, Luke Robitaille, and the great Wayne Gretzky. Oh, this one wasn't going to be easy, but our hero and the Leafs as a whole were ready. The rabid Gardens crowd is ready for Game 1, and the Leafs continue their momentum. Gilmore is in on all 4 goals in a 4-1 Leafs win. Game 2 was very competitive, and the Leafs led 2-1 after one, but Kelly Rudy barred the door the rest of the way, and the Kings came back to win 3-2. The series is tied and shifts to Los Angeles. The Kings are outplaying the Leafs in every way and lead 2-0 in Game 3, but the Leafs do come back to tie it at a point, 2-2, but the Kings are just too good on this night. They grab a 4-2 win and take a 2-1 series lead. But again, why should the Leafs panic for Game 4? As they've been down going into Game 4 in every series so far, and they've won every Game 4, and this one is no different. That's right, they win 4-2 to tie the series at 2. Dave so far, however, only has an assist in the series. Game 5 heads back to Toronto, and it's a scoreless opening period, but the Kings, however, have a 2-0 lead in the second. But Krushelnyski scores late in the frame, and Lefebvre ties it. In the third period, we're up to overtime. The clock is winding down in the first overtime frame. Rudy and Potvin are playing great net, but with 40 seconds to go, our hero sets up a man no stranger to clutch winners, Glenn Anderson, and the Leafs are 1 win away from their first Cup final since their last win in 1967. Oh, I don't believe it. Yes, Dave Andreychuk. Can you believe it? He had never even won a playoff series going into this season. Now he's 1 game away from the finals. Yes. Well, Game 6. Well, to spare Leaf fans and the fact that I'm getting sick of hearing about it and talking about it, let's sum it up as quick as we can. Leafs lead 2-1, yada yada, take stupid penalties. Kings score 3 power play goals. Kings lead 4-2, blah 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 blah. Wendell comes up in a clutch with 2 goals. One with 1:21 to go, we're up to OT, yada 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 yada. High stick to Gilmore from Gretzky. Refs miss it, yada yada. Leaf fans want to lynch Carey Fraser, and they whine about it for the next 29 years, blah blah blah. Gretzky scores, we're up to Game 7. But hey, the Leaf fans, they still keep the faith, and our hero needs to play a big game. He's been shut down by Kings checkers and has had no goals and just 2 assists. But Gretzky, who gets booed mercilessly out of the building, scores a short-handed goal in the first. Sandstrom scores later. It's 2-0 Kings after 1. We're on the power play in the second. Dave sets up Wendell, and the Leafs are back in it. Later on, however, Anderson scores, and the game is tied at 2-2. But Buzzkill Gretzky scores not long after. It's 3-2 Kings after 2. But 1:25 into the third period, Maple Leaf Gardens roars. Wendell scores again. It's 3-3, and the clock is winding down. The fans are buzzing. Everyone's on the edge of their seat. We're tied, but with 3:51 to go, Mike Donnelly scores for the Kings. This can't be good. But wait, 37 seconds later, Gretzky scores the hat trick. 5-3 Kings? Man alive, the Leaf fans of the Gardens are a sad bunch, and the clock is about to strike midnight to turn the Leafs into the proverbial pumpkin on their Cinderella season. But stop! The press is 1:07 to go. Dave sets up Dave Emmett. The Leafs are down by a goal. They still have time. They press and press and press, and the clock strikes 0. The Kings are up to the Stanley Cup Finals, and Leaf fans are haunted to this day over Game 6. You still could have won Game 7, just saying. Dave played well in Game 7 and set up that infamous overtime goal by Glenn Anderson in Game 5, but he was quiet most of the series with just 4 assists and a +1. During Dave's 31 games in Toronto, he had 25 goals and 13 assists for 38 points and was superb in teaming with Doug Gilmour. Also, he brought a lot to the table with Nikolai Borshevsky. Gilmour assisted on all but 9 of Dave's goals with the Leafs. In all of these categories, Borshevsky comes very close as well. But in addition to Gilmour's helpful assist, he was one of the top scorers in the NHL that season. 10 out of 13 of Dave's assists involved Gilmour in some way. Another destructive duo was born. Dave's tenure in Toronto, he improved the Leafs power play drastically as the Sabres power play actually dipped after his departure. He still finished 3rd on the team in goals despite only playing 31 games that year for them, and at long last he had a taste of playoff success, making it all the way to the 7th game of the conference finals and playing very well in the first 2 rounds, finishing the playoffs with 12 goals and 19 points in 21 games. He also had a +12 during his time in Toronto. To top it off was key in Gilmour's epic season. Before the trade, here's how all the big guns were functioning. LaFontaine and McGillney were having insane seasons as both men were among league leaders in scoring, with 92 and 78 points respectively and averaging 1.8 and 1.7 points a game also respectively, while Dale Hawerchuk was averaging an impressive 1.2. The Sabres, along with Dave, were very destructive. The growing Leafs were led by Gilmour, who was also among the top scorers in the league, averaging 1.4 points a game, while the other leading forwards in Toronto, Borshevsky and Anderson, were averaging 0.9 and 0.8 respectively, as the Sabres were 26-20 and 6 the day of the trade, as the Leafs were 24-20 and 8. The Sabres had 58 points, the Leafs were close with 56. After the trade, LaFontaine, McGillney, and Hawerchuk barely really saw any real dip in production, as they were just on a roll. LaFontaine would be second in the league in scoring that year. McGillney had an incredible 76 goals, tying for the league lead, while Andreychuk had 96 points. But as a team, the Sabres went 12-16-4 without Dave. In Toronto, Gilmore went from 1.4 points a game to an insane 1.7 after, and finished tied for 7th in league scoring. Borshevsky and Anderson saw a very slight increase in production. Dave clearly had an impact on both teams, any way you see it. But more importantly, the Leafs go 29-3 in their last 32 games this season. So Dave's crazy, insane, yet high career season, which was split into two teams, comes to an end, reaching the 50-goal mark for the very first time with 55. A career-high 99 points, just barely missing out on 100. And even that put him at just 22nd in league scoring. However, that year an NHL record 21 players had 100 points or more. However, he could take solace in the fact that he was a key contributor to 3 players finishing in the top 10. Not to mention, he had the league lead for the second straight year in power play goals, this time with 32. He had 19 playoff points and won 2 series after not being a part of any winning series in Buffalo. He finished the year with a +4, came in 3rd, just barely missing out on NHL year-end All-Star voting, and again finished 11th in Lady Byng Trophy voting. What a year for our hero. Dave's time in Buffalo saw him become one of the most beloved players in team history, and in an era where a dozen or even a few more were scoring 100 points a year. Dave was on the outside looking in, even watching a few teammates accomplish that feat. But in his 11 seasons there, Perreault, Foligno, Tucker, Turgeon, LaFontaine, Andreychuk, Housley, McGillney, and many others benefited from having Dave on their team, and of course, vice versa. He may not have had the hardware of a Gretzky or Lemieux, but he accomplished quite a bit in Buffalo. That does it for part 1 of our look at the career of the great Dave Andreychuk. Tune in to part 2 where we cover the rest of his tenure with the Leafs, a stay in the Garden State, short stints in Beantown in the Rocky Mountains, and back to where it all began. And along the way, he was reaching some milestones. Please like and hit subscribe. Until next time, I'll see ya.